Hello and welcome to our next video. In this lesson, we're going to begin our study of creating classes by creating a simple instrument class with a couple of constructors. And the instrument will have three properties: a brand, a model, and a cost. Now, you may be very familiar with working with classes, and if you are, that's okay. You may just go ahead and skip this video. But I wanted to take some time to walk through actually creating a class just to make sure everyone's on the same page before we go into actually trying to do inheritance. Because if you don't understand this, then inheritance will definitely not make any sense. All right, let's go ahead and create our first class. I'm going to right-click on the default package here and select New, Class. And I'm not going to do anything fancy with this. I'm just going to call it Instrument. And you'll note, just make a note of this. The superclass says java.lang.object. We don't need to know what that means right now. You'll also note that with the generators from Eclipse, we can actually do some fun stuff. We could put a void main in there if we wanted, but I'm not going to. And we could also have it stub in some constructors from the superclass if there are any. We're not going to do that either. And we're not going to generate comments. We'll just do that on our own so that we can see things in place. So I'm going to go ahead and select Finish. And now you'll see this bare bones class, public class instrument. And I'm going to go ahead and just line up my brackets because I like to do that. And the first thing I need to do is create variables for my three private properties. So I'm going to have a brand, a model, and a cost. So I'm just going to say private string, and I'm going to say the brand. And then I'm going to say private string the model. Now you can name your variables whatever you want, but I'll show you in a minute why I'm naming them exactly this way. This final one is going to be a double, private double the cost. Now, with Java, because of the fact of the way things are set up, and we'll look at this in a little more detail later, I already have a default constructor. I need to do nothing else, and my code would compile and run an instrument. But I can't do anything with it yet. And one other thing that we're going to look at is building a complex constructor here. And once we add any constructors other than the default goes away unless we actually add it back. So the first thing I'm going to do is just add back in the default constructor. Now to create a constructor, it needs to be public, and it needs to be named exactly the same as my class, instrument. Nothing else, nothing more. And so here we see public instrument. Now, one last note of importance in Java: if I have a public class declared in my file needs to be named the same. Instrument.java means my public class needs to be instrument. If I were to change this to my instrument, we're going to have a problem because it's going to say that this doesn't line up with the name of the file, and it must be defined in its own file. So that will help us to remember not to do that, but it should be pretty straightforward. And most of the time we're going to be creating it from the generators, and so we won't even have that issue. But if you were doing this stuff by hand, maybe on your own with a custom compiler or whatever, locally on your machine, you might remember your files need to be named the same as your public classes. So there's nothing else to do in the instrument constructor, so I'm just going to type in here do nothing. And the next thing I'm going to do is create the complex or explicit constructor. And right now I'm just going to do that so that it lines up. But we need to make sure that we actually are doing something different than the original constructor. Otherwise, it would be an error. You see the red X's. So what I'm going to do is take in three variables, and they need to line up by type to the three variables I want to set. So the first one needs to be a string, and we're just going to call this brand. Now this is why I named my local variable the brand. This is going to be string model, and this is going to be double cost. You might say, well, Brian, why do I need to name them differently? And actually the answer is you don't. The compiler should be able to figure it out. The system should work. However, you look at that and it's easier to read as a human knowing which one I'm setting from and to, and then to work with them locally. Also, if you get a scope issue where you're trying to use a local variable and you try to set something internally inside of a method or a constructor that's being passed in, that's really not a good practice. So it's better to name it something different. And I wanted the ones that are exposed to the public to be named more friendly than the ones that are local and private that don't really matter. So here all we're going to do is say the brand equals brand. And I did that by hitting Control and space, and it brought up some IntelliSense for me. So I can type the, and then I can use my arrow keys, the model, equals model. And again, control space will easily bring this up. The cost equals cost. Again, these have to line up by type. It doesn't matter what we name them. I could have named it super duper brand or whatever I wanted to, and it'd be fine. What we can see is when I save that, it compiles. Everything seems to be in place. Now I have some unit tests in place here, so let's just take a quick look at them. My instruments are here. I have a brand, a model, a cost, and a delta, which is important when working with doubles to do comparisons, just so we don't get some sort of shifting bit error, and make sure they're very similar and can actually be declared equal even if for some reason the bits were off just a little bit and the numbers would look like 0.9999999 and 1. Those are actually considered equal by putting this delta to 0.00001. We set the two constructors right away in the setup method, which allows my test to run this every time before every test. So each test will start with a new instrument and a new complex instrument with those variables passed in. So that's important. Remember, your test should be independent. And here I have my test instrument. I'm just going to assert not null that my instrument was created. I'm going to test that the string double was working by making sure it's not null. That's basically my complex constructor. And I just created another one for fun. And also here I put a to-do to remember that we need to do these properties later. So I'm going to run this test by selecting Run As JUnit Test. And we see that my tests have passed as expected. In my program here as well, I just want to show you that in case you're not really familiar with unit testing, off the top here, you could go ahead and select Run As here for a Java application, and you could see it print out. But it doesn't make any sense right now, which is something we'll examine in more detail later in the course as well. Well, that wraps up our look at the creation of a default instrument class with basic constructor and explicit constructor or complex constructor. And that sets us up to get ready to work with properties in the next video. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.